Hello, everyone. Welcome into an episode of We Witnessed. My name is Chip Brewster. I'm a national digital host with Nexstar Media. On this series, we take a look back through archival footage that Nexstar Media Group, or one of its local stations, has owned or collected at some of the biggest stories that began as local stories and grew to capture national, if not international, headlines. This episode is going to focus on the person who most commonly became known as the Golden State Killer, but honestly, it began as three separate people. That is because over the course of more than a decade, he ended up terrorizing three different areas of the state of California. So this video footage will actually come from all across the state, multiple stations. We have KTXL in Sacramento, KRON in San Francisco, KTLA in Los Angeles. And some of those names given to this individual when we didn't know it was one person, the original Nightstalker, the East Area Rapist, the Visalia Ransacker, all linked together through DNA evidence. To catch you up on not only the backstory of this individual and the multiple cases, I have a collection of videos put together, just as what the media does, with a little bit of backstory, and also the 2016 relaunch of effort to find him. So let's start with that video.
June 1976, exactly 40 years ago, Sacramento filled with fear and panic.
You only need to say three words, and that is the East Area Rapist. And everybody remembers it.
A string of rapes and burglaries near Rancho Cordova, and the East Area Rapist's ruthless, decade-long crime spree throughout the state.
It was a time when, really, in essence, a community was taken hostage. Everybody knew it. It was on the news every night.
Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert was 12 when the East Area Rapist, also known as the original Nightstalker and Golden State Killer, began his rampage, preying on young women and couples. Wednesday, investigators said this is the most accurate sketch of the man they've linked to a dozen homicides, 45 rapes, and 120 burglaries in Sacramento, the Bay Area, and Southern California.
He would bring his own bindings with him, and very often those were shoelaces. They were tied together.
In the year 2000, investigators were able to use DNA to link all the crimes. Now they're asking for the public's help to finally find the elusive killer.
To some extent, it's a needle in a haystack effort, but the needle's there, and it's a matter of persistence of finding the needle.
Desperate for answers and eager to solve the mystery, the FBI is offering a $50,000 reward for information leading them to the East Area Rapist.
I have regularly retired detectives, retired members of this department that provide input and leads and tips and suggestions and ideas.
We've spoken to three former investigators who spent years trying to find the East Area Rapist here in Sacramento. They all tell us the case is still with them long after retirement. One of them wrote this book. The other tells us her heart is still with the victims.
40 years doesn't lessen the intensity of the pain and grief.
Investigators are hopeful this renewed effort will inspire someone to speak up and help close a dark and unfinished chapter in Sacramento's past.
Somebody knows something.
And of course, the big point of We Witnessed is to speak with somebody that covered the event, witnessed the event, was part of the event. And we're lucky enough that joining us for this episode is the woman that we saw at the very beginning. I'm stalling. There it is, right there. But we've got her in person with us now, Anne Marie Schubert, former district attorney for Sacramento County, California. Anne Marie, thank you for taking the time to revisit what I'm sure is still something that is discussed in your personal and professional life as a moment in your lifetime that you'll never forget.
Absolutely, no question about that.
Before we get into the specifics of the case and the investigation and the breakthrough, there was a piece that actually stuck out to me within the story we just listened to that called you out and said you were 12 when he was active in the Sacramento area, and you grew up in the Sacramento area. And they went on to talk about how it was on the news every night and was really had a grip on the community. Do you remember, even as a teenager, the impact that this man's crimes was having on your area?
Oh, no doubt about it. I came from a family of 7 kids. We lived about 1 mile to 2 miles from kind of the epicenter of these crimes.
Wow.
So it was very, very much on everybody's mind as a child, as a teenager, but then also growing up as a prosecutor working in Sacramento. anybody that lived in Sacramento during that time period had their own personal story. So it was something that very much had an impact on me, both personally and professionally as well.
I have to imagine, too, once you got into criminal justice, and I have some notes here that before you were district attorney, which was 2014 to 2022, you were a trial attorney. You prosecuted some of the state's most violent cases. That when you got into it, the discussions that you had to have with fellow investigators, fellow prosecutors on these cases and how they still had not been solved. I mean, we're talking decades after this person went silent and stopped being active.
No doubt about it. So I was fortunate kind of early on in my career as a prosecutor to handle my very first DNA case, and that was in 1994. And I realized, now 30 plus years later, that DNA is the greatest tool ever given to law enforcement to find the truth, no matter where it leads us. And so over the years, I kind of became somewhat obsessed with DNA cases. Then I got into teaching cold cases, and I started working on cold cases. And then in around 2000, I went to my boss and said, hey, we should start a cold case unit and we should solve the East Area Rapist.
Yeah.
And so I was given that kind of green light to try to work with that, that case and work with investigators. And really that was my first introduction to the actual investigation itself.
And for me, I feel like cold cases, DNA, it's also now. At the time, that was novel stuff. There weren't departments using that as a investigative tool.
Oh, no doubt about that. So really in the first case I had in 1994, which involved a stranger kidnapping a teenager and raping her, it was very, very novel at the time. And I had to do a bunch of hearings on whether it was reliable and things like that. And then over time, and the thing is that DNA is advanced. So yes, cold cases are kind of more common now, but the science has evolved so much in the last 25 years that we can do so much more now. And I mean, the Golden State Killer is perhaps the best example of how far we've come in our ability to solve crime.
Well, and let's go now to that 2000 area when it was DNA evidence that linked all of these different series of events. So I had my notes in here. In total, 13 murders, 51 plus rapes, 120 plus burglaries, but it was 74 to 76-ish active in Northern California, 76 to 79 Sacramento specifically, 79 to 86 Southern California. And so at the time, these were treated separate. But tell me about when they were finally linked together and this became the Golden State Killer.
Well, it was kind of interesting. So when as I mentioned, I went to my boss and said, hey, can we start a cold case unit? Can we solve the East Area Rapist? At the time, we had no idea that he was responsible for these murders. There were suspicions over the years and probably very righteous suspicions. And so I started looking for evidence myself. And I physically would start calling people, calling our crime lab, all that stuff. And ultimately, I ended up making a call to this guy I didn't know at the time, but this person named Paul Holes, who happened to be working in Contra Costa. He was both a cop and a crime lab person. And so I called him and we talked about it because we could not find our rape kits in Sacramento. So coincidentally, Paul had been doing the same thing. It was because Paul Holes was able to find rape kits in that county and do the DNA testing that connection to all those Southern California murders occurred. And that's when we had that, excuse my language, kind of holy moly moment and realized we're not just dealing with a serial rapist, we're dealing with a serial killer as well.
My goodness. And so that connected them, sort of renewed the investigation. At that point, I feel like you had to feel so close. And yet here we go, another 16 years go by. You've become the DA of Sacramento County by that point, and you're still not at that moment. We had the video at the start there. That was 2016, where you had this kind of renewed call for the effort.
Right.
Now bring us to that moment. What changed in 2016, and what lines of investigation were you then able to pursue?
Well, I think what changed, and I don't want to say that press conference solved the case, but I definitely think it renewed interest. What I had always found interesting, and maybe it's because I grew up in Sacramento, I understood the magnitude, but I hadn't seen that much media attention on the case. I mean, people, for whatever reason, are kind of obsessed with true crime and serial killers. There wasn't a lot of media attention. And so when that press conference happened, when the sheriff's department hosted it, I came over, the FBI got involved, offered the reward. I think it changed the dynamic, and it got a lot of attention. And since that time, like you mentioned at the beginning, documentaries, news stories. And so for me, I was fortunate because I was now the elected and we had our own crime lab and I was able to put more resources on it. Again, I'm not going to say that solved it, but having more of a focused energy, we dedicated people from the DA's office, the crime lab, the sheriff's office, and then obviously Paul Holes was involved, the FBI, a guy named Steve Kramer, who was, became very, very much more of a cohesive group, I would say, and more resources. But again, really, ultimately, the seismic shift, as one of the victims calls it, occurred when this idea of doing genealogy kind of arose through really Paul Holes' idea. I mean, he gets the credit for that idea for sure.
Well, we're going to jump ahead now to 2018, only 2 years later, which sounds like a lot to some people, but when you look at 5 decades of waiting, lightning fast. And so here is one of our other archival stories, and this is from when he was found and arrested.
The answer was and always was going to be in the DNA.
Officials out of Sacramento announcing today a breakthrough in a 40-year cold case, the arrest of 72-year-old Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer, the so-called Golden State Killer, a man suspected of 12 murders and at least 40 rapes dating back to 1976.
We found the needle in the haystack, and it was right here in Sacramento.
This morning, police treating DeAngelo's home as a potential crime scene. This is where he was taken into custody, a house in a quiet neighborhood of Citrus Heights in Northern California. He's lived there for more than 3 decades, unnoticed. He wasn't even a suspect until 6 days ago.
Over the last few days, as information started to point towards this individual, we started some surveillance. We were able to get some discarded DNA, and we were able to confirm what we thought we already knew, that we had our man.
Over the last 40 years, police have combed through countless crime scenes, victims recalling descriptions of their attacker, but nothing could pin down this monster until now. Investigators narrowed down their search to the East Bay area, and from discarded DNA from DeAngelo's home, they made a match with genetic evidence linked to the crimes.
This was a true convergence of emerging technology and dogged determination by detectives.
DeAngelo was an officer at the Auburn Police Department in the 1970s, but he was fired in 1979 for shoplifting. He is now being held without bail.
We are committed, we are determined, and we will, God willing, hold this man fully accountable for his crimes.
The thing that I hear in there, and I'd love for you to confirm, he was never a suspect until DNA pointed your office to him. Is that accurate?
That's accurate. He was never, there was a lot of lists made in this case, and he was never on any list. Honestly.
What was the moment, this is now, you're not the current DA, you can kind of lift the curtain just a little bit more, when you got that DNA hit, and there was now a suspect related to this new technique, to using genealogy. What was that moment like in the office?
Oh, I think it was surreal. I think it was just like, I think it took a long time to kind of realize the magnitude of the moment. We were so focused on getting everything we needed done to make sure we were prepared for that arrest and prepared for the prosecution. But I think it was just a moment in time, obviously I'm never going to forget, but just gratitude and relief, really, ultimately.
And going forward, you had a lot to prove. You had DNA backing that up, but connecting all of that, really proving the evidence of DNA. Because even though it had been another couple of decades, there were still some questions about it. And I'm going to immediately jump to the next story that I have here, because this, I don't want to jump it that way, but this is another one of our archival stories which actually touches on how that evidence is collected, the validity of it, and the likelihood that it had gone wrong. And so now let's get to that story.
He's accused of 12 murders, 57 rapes, and more than 100 burglaries. But a new document released tied to Joseph DeAngelo, the man known across California as the Golden State Killer, indicates he did not succeed every time he tried his violent acts. Part of the investigative file made public details an incident that happened 2 years into his 12-year crime spree. Detectives say a woman he bound and gagged after forcing her car door open eventually broke free from him. Her car was found abandoned the next day with her dog locked in the trunk. For those unable to escape one of California's most prolific killers, DNA extracted from a tissue thrown in the trash at DeAngelo's home and lifted from a door handle on a car he parked in a public lot may be the key to justice. According to prosecutors, they can prove it's a solid match to the profile of the suspect who raped a Ventura woman in 1980 and then killed her and her husband.
There's always a possibility that there's a DNA mistake.
But looking at the kind of match prosecutors believe they have, a DNA expert and forensic biology professor says that's unlikely.
47.5 septillion times more likely that he was the originator or distributor of that semen sample, in other words, that he committed that rape, than a random person in the population.
You always look at how many contributors there were to the original sample. If there's just one, that's great for the prosecution.
You know, essentially, this is about as good as it gets. There are 7 billion people on our planet, and you would have to search 7 quintillion Earths to find one person who was a match to that same DNA profile. A quintillion has 18 zeros.
And I feel like that story is really answering the questions that I would be asking you, but I still imagine in court the DNA was challenged, the collection method was challenged, the validity of it was challenged. Apologies, because I didn't go back and actually watch all the court videos to see what kind of conversations and back and forths were given. But how did it go from the prosecution side to use this evidence to then prove he was the Golden State Killer?
Well, once the DNA match was made, then all of the pieces started to come together. This is where I say there's kind of this marriage between science and law enforcement, because, you know, the DNA identified him, and then it was then building that case. And so I give nothing but credit to law enforcement, because they had to go then and say, okay, well, did he live in the area? Did he match a physical description? What's his background? So some of the things that we knew before the DNA happened was there were suspicions that he was a police officer, that he was in the military, that all these other things, that he was, you know, certain physical description. All that started to fall into place because he obviously he was a police officer in Exeter, this town in middle, you know, Central California. He was right in the area. He went to the police academy right where all these burglaries are happening. Then he moves up to Sacramento area right when all the rapes start happening. He then, you know, goes to Southern California. So all those pieces started to come together. Now, remember, he did not go to trial. So while he had some very good lawyers, ultimately the decision was made that he was going to plead guilty and admit all these crimes, and he would avoid the death penalty.
Well, that does answer my question right there. And it shows, as I stated, I didn't go back to look at any of the actual court proceedings. So there was a guilty plea. We're going to take a quick break, but I do want to talk about the sentencing and the victim. A group of people, that not only survivors of his acts, but the family members of some of those impacted. After this quick break that we have to take, we will be right back. And we are back. Chip Brewster, Anne Marie Schubert. Thank you again for joining me to talk about the Golden State Killer. So we've done the whole buildup. The crimes that happened 70s and 80s, the DNA, the way technology changed, finding him, arresting him. Now we're going to talk about the end of this, the sentencing. So I have one last video to play, and this is kind of sums up not only the sentencing, the few words that he had, and some of the reactions that went with that.
Friday was sentencing day for Joseph DeAngelo, but before you hear from him, let's remind you of some of the lives he's destroyed. Newlyweds Keith and Patty Harrington were murdered in their Dana Point home in 1980.
Patty was raped, they were tied up, and they were bludgeoned to death. And Patty was much more brutalized than Keith.
Ron and Bruce Harrington were Keith's brothers, and they still haven't gotten over it.
The 3 remaining brothers taking the mattress to the dump. That he just never get over that.
The Golden State Killer, or GSK as he came to be known, would commit similar crimes up and down the state before being caught in 2018 thanks to familial DNA. DeAngelo pled guilty to 13 murders and has been described by one district attorney as a sociopath, even after his arrest. She said while DeAngelo tried to portray himself as a feeble old man in court, jail surveillance video tells a different story. Another DA was less than impressed with this apology from the killer during Friday's sentencing.
I've listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry for every one of them.
That statement apologizing was a fake. Because if he was truly remorseful about apologizing to everyone, to quote him, who he hurt, he would have included a hell of a lot more people.
Chip Yost, KLA 5 News.
And so just a snippet of the proceedings. We didn't even really hear victim impact statements, which was a part of sentencing, but the victims themselves, Anne Marie, had formed almost a community. They began to know each other and to talk about their experiences, what had happened in their lives since they were impacted by him and how that had impacted them. I assume that you got to know many of the victims along the way as well.
Oh, very much so. I met several of them even before the arrest, and then since the arrest, and now even 8 years later, I still work with many of them on a variety of issues, teaching and speaking and policy and advocacy. So yes, I think, when it all happened, it was, I'm sure many of them felt like they got hit by a truck because it came out of nowhere. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of them got together and they formed a support group, and I think it really, really helped them get through the process, especially because it took a while, and, they could appreciate each other's position and they could find comfort in that as well.
And I do want to make sure that we include the facts part of this, that he was convicted 13 counts of first-degree murder. It was also convicted on other counts. Those were the big ones, though, that resulted in 13 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. And so those were the results of the guilty plea. What do you think are the results, though, on the criminal justice community of the way that you were able to blaze this trail using DNA to connect all of these events across the state of California, but then two, find somebody who did it decades later?
It's funny because at the time it was all happening, I don't think any of us really realized the impact it would have on the justice system. But what we've learned is that it has changed significantly the ability to solve crime. And so, genealogy is an extraordinary tool that had never really been used in a criminal case. Now we're seeing it used not only across the state, across the country, but now other countries are starting to use it. It's really, it's gratifying, obviously, but for me, it's like we owe it to families to do this work. They've gone through so much, and we should do everything in our power. And this is just the next thing that has really changed the world.
And you actually can drive your own point home here. I'm going to play one last clip of video. It's not related to the Golden State Killer, but it is another case that you were working on sort of in tandem, and it was the results of the Golden State Killer that allowed you to proceed forward. Before we discuss that, let's take a look back at this piece of video.
The answer has always been in the DNA.
Speaking before dozens of cameras, Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert made another cold case bombshell announcement. A suspect has been arrested in the NorCal Rapist case.
Yesterday, Sacramento police detectives arrested Roy Charles Waller, a 58-year-old man living in Benicia. The suspect is married and has had the same job for the last 25 years.
According to investigators, Waller is believed to have raped 10 victims in 6 different Northern California counties, beginning in Rohnert Park in Sonoma County back in 1991.
And over the next 15 years, had several sexual assaults in Rohnert Park, Sonoma, Vallejo, Martinez, Woodland, Chico, 2 sexual assaults in Davis, and ending here in Sacramento in 2006.
The lead detective in the 2 Sacramento attacks described how Waller would break into his victims' homes late at night, often while they were asleep.
He would bind them and then repeatedly sexually assault them. And sometimes he would kidnap the victims and take them to ATMs where he would get money out of their accounts, and other times he would steal personal items from their homes.
Schubert says investigators used Florida-based GEDmatch, the same DNA genealogy website as the East Area Rapist case, to find a relative match to their suspect's DNA. She adds it took them just 10 days to narrow in on Waller and obtain a secondary sample from him.
I would just say abandoned DNA.
When was that?
In the last 10 days.
And that opening line that we heard from you there, also that it was the DNA, it was always the DNA. You had said that as well with the DeAngelo case. Some of the statistics on Waller really quick. Sentenced to 897 years to life in prison, 46 counts of rape, sodomy, kidnapping collectively, and arrested. It was September 2018. So keeping in mind that you had arrested DeAngelo April 2018, talk about a very quick turnaround in using those same techniques.
Yeah, so while we were doing the Golden State Killer, you know, in our minds, we already knew all the other unsolveds we had in Sacramento. And the NorCal was at the top of the list because of the severity and the length of time. And so, you know, as the Golden State Killer kind of came to an arrest and prosecution, then we started to focus on the NorCal Rapist. And that was really an extraordinary amount of work, but it also really revealed him very quickly, quite frankly.
To wrap up this episode, just because we're running out of time, I'm curious if you feel that because of these developments in technology, the efforts both on your part and the entire team that you had working with you, are we collectively safer because of all this?
I think so. I think if, you know, it still has a ways to go in terms of resources and funding. But the thing I always say is the sooner we catch a serial rapist or a serial killer, the sooner we prevent crime and the sooner we, you know, exonerate people that have nothing to do with it. So I think we have the capacity to prevent serial offenses. That's what we have with this new technology. So it's exciting. It's a very exciting time to be.
There you go. And this is, you know, technology continues to evolve. So maybe one day I'll do a separate episode looking back at just this episode in the conversation and say, wow, things have changed since then.
Yeah. Very good. Well, thanks for having me.
Yes, of course. And thank you for joining us and revisiting that time. And for everyone else out there watching, we appreciate you taking the time to watch another episode of We Witnessed. Until the next one, I'm Chip Brewster. Take care, everybody.